And amid all of this, you may be wondering just where Syrian refugees are going. Well, the answer, right in their own backyard. Turkey has about 1.6 million registered Syrian refugees. Lebanon has 1.2 million. That's even more significant considering the country has a population of just over 4 million. Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt round out the top 5 for countries hosting Syrian refugees. Let's talk more about this with Will Haney. He's an associate director at Church World Services Immigration and Refugee Program. The organization provides legal and religious services to refugees and immigrants. Will, thanks so much for joining us. Nearly 4 million Syrians have fled across the border. The temporary solution of housing them, of course, refugee camps, it's almost become semi-permanent. Give us an idea of the impact of this and how difficult it is.
Thank you, Mike. Today there are refugees all around the world, and especially with the Syria crisis, refugees on average now are spending about 20 years in a refugee camp. So the situation, we talk about it being permanent, and it really does start to seem like that. 20 years in a refugee camp, it's not just a blink of an eye. That's almost a lifetime for many of these families.
And when you think of escaping war, you think the horror is gone, but acceptance is also an issue. I know in Lebanon, there's been a lot of resentment. There was a story recently about how one of these camps was actually burned down by a mob. They were angry. Talk to me about that part of the equation.
Well, the international community does its best to provide for refugees, but resources are limited. We keep pressuring groups and agencies and countries around the world to do more. And, a lot of countries are stepping up to the table. The United States has been providing quite a bit of aid to the region, but there's always room to do more and to provide for refugees. In the Middle East, a lot of these Syrian refugees are in urban locations. And so that's, a new dynamic to the situation. It's not like, previous populations, and they're living, in cities, in rural areas, not in the confines of a camp.
Will, refugees, of course, tend to come from war-torn countries. This is an example, but talk to me about the screening process. How do you make sure that they're not militants? This was, of course, a concern that came up in Jessica's story there.
Yeah, so as Jessica mentioned, the screening for refugees is extremely intense. We go through many different interviews as refugees come to the United States. They're interviewed by UNHCR, they're interviewed by agencies overseas, and then they're vetted by different intelligence agencies here in the United States. And that process is not light. That process is quite heavy, and they go through quite a bit of screening. They're one of the most scrutinized populations that come to the United States. So we can think of it as refugees just not, arriving here tomorrow. Refugees are really going through a process to make sure that only the most needy and the most vulnerable are getting to the United States.
What about, you brought up the United States. There is this push for wealthy countries like China and the U.S. to do more, host more refugees. Is that part of the solution, and what kind of issues does that present?
So refugee resettlement around the world is really only available for a select few amount of refugees. So really only about 1 to 2% of refugees all around the world are going to be resettled to a third country like the United States or European countries or even China. So really, this isn't a solution for the general refugee crisis, but what we can do is provide more spaces for refugees, more opportunities for refugees to find a new home in the United States, and provide for our communities here to welcome them to the United States. That's really giving them a new hope and really bringing our communities, to bear and to help them out.
You said more spaces and new hope. That's the optimum, but looking at it right now, looking at this crisis, where do you see it near term and where do you see it long term?
Well, the crisis has been going on for several years now, and it doesn't appear that it's going to stop. At the moment, we're hoping that more money and more funds and more capabilities will come to provide for refugees on the ground in countries around the Middle East, but also more spaces to provide that hope and to continue that hope for refugees that do make it towards resettlement. The United States is looking to resettle more Syrians in the years to come, and we welcome that initiative, and we're here as an agency on the ground ready to help in the United States.
Will Haney joining us from New York. Thanks so much.